Hi everybody. Today we're going to look at 18th century literature and how it was influenced or directly impacted by the Age of Reason. But before I get started on that, I just kind of want to review of where we have been so that we can have a better understanding of where we're going. So we began with the conquest of the Americas. We looked at how this conquest was certainly indicative of or representative of the concept of the other, and how we begin to get those concepts of race and racism integrated into American belief systems really from the inception of America, or the colonization of America. We also looked at the travel logs and what particular rhetorical purpose they served and how they were used to influence royalty to further support the explorers and the expansion into the Americas. And then next we looked at the Puritans and how they were persecuted and came from Europe to settle here in a place where they would no longer be persecuted, and how by being here or coming here they still kept those same traditional philosophies in that they viewed the Native Americans as the other, and certainly were not, for the most part, again generalizing, quite very kind to the Native Americans, and there were a great deal of conflict between the Native Americans and the Puritans. We also looked at lay sermons. We looked at some of the superstitions, the concepts of witchcraft and that sort of thing that were prevalent in the Puritans' life. We discussed or looked at how the Puritans blamed everything that happened to them basically on God, whether it was good or bad. If something good happened, it was because they were in God's good graces. If something bad happened, it was because they did something that wasn't particularly good, and so God was punishing them. So we move from that period to what really is a sharp change in thinking, and it really heralds the concept of modern day thought, and in that is we move away from the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages were a period that was really steeped in superstition, torture. The church and the king were the prevailing thoughts, and the king supposedly has a divine connection with God, and so does the Pope. And so we've got these really close philosophical ideas that, if the king says something, you're going to do it because he's directly getting his ideas from God. So all of these kinds of beliefs have come together, and we're moving kind of to the next step past that. And the Age of Reason, which is in Europe it was called the Age of Enlightenment, is a particularly important period in time because this is the first period where we have mass publications, so that the written word is not being represented in hand-copied pieces of writing, and that we have mass publication brought to the Americas so that text can be distributed to anyone in America, and anyone who can read has the ability to read and think about and discuss the ideas in the text. Up until this particular period, it was just those few who had the written text who really kind of controlled the way that people thought. So this is the very beginning of what we would call an open society, where individuals are permitted to pursue individual ideas of happiness and liberty. We're going to talk about that concept of happiness a little bit later. So the Age of Reason is the imperial concepts of the medieval world are no longer influential, and we're looking at man as an eager explorer still, but he's looking at ideas and what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to own land? And you can ask these questions now in America, and you are free of being retaliated against. No one's going to burn you at the stake or, make you go bobbing in the water to see if you're a witch, just because you want to talk about these new ideas. And so man now feels obligated to follow his own intellect, his own ideas, and not the revealed truth as it's been revealed by the Puritans or some religious entity. So earth and science and nature become the emphasis, and ideas like miracles and prophecy and religious rites are kind of pushed to the side. They're just superstition. It's not the real world. So, and this is when we start looking at reason and logic. And reason, the definition, is the ability to form and operate concepts in abstraction, narrowing information to its bare content without emotion. So you're trying to make meaning out of these abstract ideas like freedom and love, and you're trying to take the emotional components out of it. So you're not looking at how it feels to be free, but what it means to be free, what it means to have the ability to love. So the first author that we look at is Elizabeth Ashbridge, and she's born in England. She elopes with her husband at the age of 14, and this wasn't a horribly young age. It was young, but it wasn't too bad. But the reason why her parents disowned her is because of her husband's philosophical and religious beliefs. They went against her parents. And so her parents, once she marries him, they banish her from their home, and he dies shortly after they're married, and so she's left to kind of fend for herself. So she, being quite a adventuresome spirit, travels to Ireland, where she starts to learn about different religions, and eventually she immigrates as an indentured servant to America when she is 19 years old. So she's had 5 years from the age of 14 until 19 where she's living on her own and taking care of herself. But Ashbridge is a real deep thinker, and she wants to better understand religion. It was her ideas and her thinking and her husband's thinking that really drew her to her husband to begin with. And so when she's in Ireland, she tries on the Baptist religion. She doesn't really like it that much. She looks at Presbyterianism and Catholicism, and she really bounces from these different churches because she is a deeply religious person, a deeply philosophical soul, but no one will allow her to be a minister. She's female, she's this young woman, educated, but again, a deep thinker, but on her own. So she's certainly not what you would consider a traditional minister material. So she comes to America as an indentured servant, and she's working, and she goes to visit some relatives in Pennsylvania, where she is introduced to the Quaker philosophy, and she quickly becomes convinced that this is the way for her. And so she becomes really a pretty faithful Quaker. However, her current husband, not too happy with that. He really was more in love with the happy-go-lucky Elizabeth Ashbridge, who enjoyed adventures and was willing to go out on her own at the age of 14. So they have trials and tribulations, and I can't remember if she divorces him, but in any way, or he dies. But something happens, and she's up to her third husband. Aaron Ashbridge. He is also a Quaker, and so now is her first time to really be able to practice her faith freely after marrying him. And if you look at the Quaker religion, if you watch the 2 videos that I posted about the Quaker religion, you'll get a better understanding, I think, of why that particular philosophy really spoke to her, because she was able to, if not be a minister, at least to practice her religion in a meaningful way to her. So what you're going to be reading reading is her an excerpt from her autobiography, and it's quite interesting because it goes over all of her trials and tribulations, her adventures, and so you'll get to see a little bit of her adventuresome spirit with that, and and where her philosophical beliefs come from. So let's talk a little bit about the Quakers. The Quakers were founded by George Fox in 1647 in England. Fox was born into a very strict Puritan family, but he left at the age of 19 to find the truth. He married his wealthy supporter's widow, Margaret Fell, as a marriage of equals. And that's something that you'll see, that's a theme that you'll see throughout the Quakers, is the sense of equality. But as a Quaker, he was frequently persecuted and imprisoned, and he spent his life really working towards expanding and organizing the Quaker movement. So he's a huge person in the Quaker beliefs. And some of their beliefs, just to kind of give you a brief overview of Quakerism, and I think you'll find some of these concepts, as you'll see some of these will sound a little familiar to you, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Every man and woman has direct access to God. There is no such thing as the elect. Churches are not necessarily needed because there isn't a priestly class. Everyone is just as godly and holy as their neighbor. No one is chosen. And that means that no one is not chosen. So basically, where you end up at the end of your life depends on who you are and what you do. So every single person, male, female, free or slave, is of equal worth. So there's not a caste system. Again, as we see in Jefferson, as we saw in the Puritans, there aren't an elect few. It is everyone is of equal value. No person is more important than the other. And the Quakers don't believe that you need these rich, elaborate ceremonies and all of, you don't have to burn a candle in order to experience God in your daily life. And that you should have an inward light that you can follow and lead to spiritual development. And of course, your goal is towards individual perfection. But again, no one person is better than the other. So I think that that's really, really interesting. The next author that you're going to encounter is John Woolman. And I include him because he has written a piece that I find is truly representative of what I would like to believe are American ideals. He is our first truly American person that we're reading. He was a well-known minister, Quaker minister, and abolitionist. He was born in New Jersey to a Quaker family, so he was raised in the Quaker family, and he was also educated alongside Native Americans. So he didn't have that sense of separateness that you get from the traditional Puritans. He was known for wearing primarily white clothes, and I think this is a really kind of cool factoid, I guess, that because the slaves made dyed fabric, so he refused to wear any fabric that was dyed. So he really did believe and live his ideals. He fought against slavery within the Quaker faith. He traveled up and down the East Coast and observed slavery firsthand in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. And he insisted whenever he would travel as a great Quaker speaker, he would travel and stay at people's homes, and he would insist on paying the slaves for anything that they did for him. So, for example, if a slave carried his suitcase up to his room, he would pay the slave for that. He did not believe in purchasing slave-made goods because the slaves obviously did not get profit from their work. He also preached against cruelty to animals, economic injustice, oppression, conscription, and slavery. So he really is one of our first truly American thinkers who is looking at this idea of equality and taking it very sincerely and deeply, not just practicing the words or saying the words, but actually practicing this in his everyday life. And that is one of the reasons why I think that he is so very important to us, is that he really has, he really does live what his words or what his religion states. And that's not true of all Quakers. Not all Quakers believed that slavery was a bad thing. It was not unusual for Quakers, along with everyone else, to own slaves. So he was really kind of at the cutting edge, I guess you could say, with that particular concept. He wrote, and that's the piece that you're going to read from, some considerations on keeping the Negroes in 1754, and he uses verses from the Bible to support his argument. So he's really making this philosophical argument and believes that enlightened Christians must understand that slavery is bad, that all nations are under one blood, that the same species as ourselves, we are in a higher station and enjoy greater favors than they, but that we're all the same people. And because of that, those of our nation, the cause of them being here, we are responsible for their well-being. So, he's particularly addressing the African Americans or the Africans that were brought to America and saying, we brought them here, therefore we are responsible for their well-being. We are responsible for taking care of them, for making sure that they are okay. So you can see he was really quite sensational in his thought at this particular time. So our next author is Ben Franklin. And you'll see there's a couple of pieces for you to watch with Franklin, I think. A short piece that just kind of goes over his biography, his life, and then another piece that looks at some of his famous quotes. And your reading journal is to reflect on some of his famous quotes. I think that's important because, again, this is the age of reason, and he is putting out all of these philosophical gems, I guess you would say, that we certainly abide by or respect today. So, for example, he said, honesty is the best policy. Certainly that's something that you've heard, I'm sure, and something that you can, sure, it's better for somebody to be honest with you than to lie to you. A penny saved is a penny earned. So that means, obviously, when you save a penny, you have earned it and saved it for yourself, and so you're up ahead of the program. And one of my favorites is, God helps them that help themselves. And again, I think that these should all be quotes that you've heard probably at some point in your lifetime. Maybe you knew they were from Franklin, maybe you didn't. But once you look at that video that I posted about the quotes, you'll see a lot of quotes that have come from him that you may have heard once or twice in your lifetime. So Franklin is another true American, and he is our first kind of person that represents what we call today the American dream, and he is the poor boy who makes good. He was born in Boston, the 15th child of a very poor candle maker, and at a young age, I think he was 8, I'm not sure, he was apprenticed to his brother, a Boston printer, and he published his first works at age 12, 2 ballads on the drowning of a lighthouse keeper and the capture of Blackbird the pirate. At 16, he's writing for his brother's newspaper using the pen name Silence Dogood. And this is really fun, his Silence Dogood pieces, because they are kind of satirical comments. He's poking fun at Boston society, politics, and religion. And again, before the Age of Reason, you really would not have seen someone doing those kinds of, making comments about the silliness of Boston politics or society. And at 17, he ran off to Philadelphia, where he became a printer in his own right. He wanted to publish things himself and not just work beneath his brother. In 1732, he uses the name Richard Saunders and begins publishing Poor Richard's Almanac, which is a calendar filled with advertisements, forecasts, recipes, jokes, and a swarm of proverbs that are still popular today. He retires from business at the age of 42, and he is wealthy and famous by this time. And this is the period when he becomes Franklin the inventor, and he really focuses on science and public service. Between 1757 and 1775, he represents the colonies in England, where his propagandizing causes the irritated British government to call him the inventor and first planner of colonial discord. So the British really don't like what Franklin's message is when he comes to England, as he is advocating for the separation of the Americas from British rule. And so they kind of blame all of this on Franklin. When he returns to Philadelphia after propagandizing in Europe, he is named a delegate to the Second Continental Congress and a member of the committee chosen to write the Declaration of Independence. In 1776, Congress sends him once again to Europe, and this time to France, where he asks for help with the revolution. At this point, the American Revolution is not going particularly well, and so he goes to France, where he is trying to seek some help and some support from their navy. And then 5 years after that, he signs the peace treaty that confirms the American victory in the Revolution and establishes the nation's independence. When he returns to America for the last time, he is named a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where he spends the last days of his life. So he is quite a traveler, quite an experienced man, and he has contributed in many, many, many ways to our culture and our understanding of the Age of Reason and what it means to be a thinker and to use scientific thought to come up with great scientific discoveries. So some of his impact on literature. He is one of the first figures who is really looking at pragmatism. And pragmatism is using logic, again, very closely related to the Age of Reason, to understand and do things. So you're using a logical, reasoned way to do something. You're not just going about it because that's the way it's always been done, but you're doing it for a particular purpose. He focuses on self-reliance, so he is often called the forerunner of Emersonian's transcendentalism, which we'll look at a little bit later in the course. He is a prolific writer and writes all kinds of essays on satire and political journalism. He's also the first kind of like how to answer your questions, help kind of writer, and sort of begins that whole genre of, how would I do this? This is how. He's sort of a very, very, very far removed forerunner of Dear Abby kind of writing. And at the 18th century, or during the 18th century, he is considered the greatest literary artist in America. So he really is a very important literary person, and he's credited for creating the first American great book. So that's Ben Franklin. there's a lot. We could just do a whole course on Ben Franklin. So I've only touched on some of the brief highlights. I feel badly because I don't do these men justice, but this is a survey, so I try to survey and not go into too much depth. Our next author is Thomas Paine, and he is really, again, quite influential in American thought and in the American Revolution, which I think you will see as you begin to read his pieces. So this is a quote from him: "Those who want to reap the benefits of this great nation must bear the fatigue of supporting it." So in other words, what he's saying is that if you want to live this free and independent life in America, you must do the hard work that requires to make it happen. That you can't just sit back and watch while others create this organization or this world. So Paine comes to America in 1774. Even though he isn't American by birth, he really does have strong influence on American thought, and that's why I include him here. He met Franklin in London and comes to America shortly thereafter. He was thinking about it, but when he meets Franklin, that makes his decision, and he decides to come right over. He wrote for the Pennsylvania Magazine, and he's motivated by the ideas of revolution that surround him, and he publishes Common Sense in 1776. So you can see that it's a very timely piece, and that it very much purports those philosophies that are important to the American Revolution. After the American Revolution has been accomplished, Paine then devotes the remainder of his life to making bridges. So he wants to make a single span iron bridge. In 1787, he sails to Europe in search of financial backers, and while in France, he witnesses the beginnings of the French Revolution. In England, he read Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution, and then he begins to write a reply, and that is Paine's The Rights of Man, which defends the revolution and insists that man is bound to no hereditary rulers. So in other words, we are not bound to rule by king. And this is a really shocking idea at this particular time in Europe, because Europe still has their kings. Just because we have separated doesn't mean that Europe has come, and today they still have. England certainly still has their queen. So what makes Paine an American author is that his common sense really does help to inspire the Declaration of Independence. And during one of the most difficult times of the Revolution, after Washington's defeat in New York and his desperate retreat across New Jersey, Paine begins to publish his crisis papers in December of 1776. So he writes Common Sense at the beginning of 1776, and then at the end of 1776, he writes his crisis papers. And Washington actually reads excerpts from Crisis aloud to his soldiers before they cross the Delaware to defeat the Hessians at Trenton. So his philosophical thought is really quite influential and impactful to the success of America, of America's independence. 15 more crisis papers are published over the next 7 years. From 1774 to 1796, Paine completes The Age of Reason, which is an attack on the irrationality of religion. And it's a very forceful statement of the doctrines of deism. Deism is that you believe in the idea of God, but not necessarily Presbyterian or Catholicism or something like that. And what Paine advocates for is an understanding of divine revelation, or of reason rather than divine revelation. So in other words, he's very much what you would call an Age of Reason man. He is looking at, you don't use these ideas that God is going to come down and give you some wonderful thought, give you some great understanding into religion, but rather you use your thoughts, you rely on science and your logic and your reason to understand what it means to be a human being. And this still, as you can imagine, even if it were published today, raised a large storm of protest. I mean, he really got quite a backlash for that kind of thinking. He is vilified in pulpits and journals, as you can imagine. Ministers do not find him very popular because his ideas are quite the antithesis to any kind of formal religion. When he dies, he asks to be buried in a Quaker cemetery and is refused. His remains are exhumed and taken to England, where they are lost, and so no one really knows today where Paine's remains are. Our next author that we're going to look at is de Creve Coeur, and de Creve Coeur is a Frenchman, and I'll read you this quote from him. But again, his thought is very influential in the Age of Reason, and you'll see that as you read through him. So what then is the American, this new man? He is neither a European or the descendant of a European. Hence that strange mixture of blood which you will find in no other country. I could point out to you a man whose grandfather was an Englishman, whose wife was Dutch, whose son married a French woman, and whose present 4 sons have now 4 wives of different nations. So what Creve Coeur is getting at here is that the melting pot concept of America, because we are a mixture of all different kinds of European races that before this particular period in history haven't necessarily mixed, and if they had, it's been very rarely. But today if somebody said, what are you, you would say an American, and that would be understood to be a melding of different beliefs. You might have some Italian in you, might have some German in you, you might have some English in you, you might have Native American, but those would all be part of who you are today. You generally don't say, when someone says, where are you from, you don't generally say, well, I have ancestors from Europe, I have some from England, some from Ireland, a few from France. You don't usually go into that much depth. You simply say you're an American. And so de Creve Coeur was quite interested in this concept of this melting pot, of this mixing together, and really commenting on the uniqueness of this concept and how it had never occurred anyplace else in the world. So he's born in Normandy in 1735, and at 19 he sails to the U.S. In 1775 he goes to Canada, and actually he sailed to Canada, in 1735, and then he enlists in Canada militia. He serves as a government surveyor and a cartographer. He buys land in Orange County, New York in 1769, and so the American Revolution, along with his Tory sympathies, made him decide to return to France. So he was more sympathetic to the British than he was to the American. However, when he tries to leave the U.S. from to go to Britain, he is held captive in New York and imprisoned as a rebel spy. So the British hold him in New York and say that he's a rebel spy, even though he's trying to go to Britain. But they think that he's trying to go to Britain to spy on Britain and return and tell the Americans about it. He finally returns to France in 1789, where he remains until he returns to the U.S. in 1783 to serve as the French consul to New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. This is when he discovers that in his absence, because when he left, he leaves his wife and his children and his farm alone. So he goes back, he's planning on going back to Europe and gets imprisoned. Then he finally is able to return to France, but he has left his farm and it's been attacked. His wife are dead, and his children are living with strangers who have taken them in. He is considered a great diplomat and was named an honorary citizen of several American cities. So, when living on his farm in Pine Hill, he writes a series of essays about America based on his travels and experiences as a farmer. And that's where Letters from an American Farmer come from. And what makes this unique, or makes it so important in American literature, is it's one of the first pieces that actually looks at what it means to be an American and what the American does every day. How do we spend our times? What is it that we do? And its readers were a society of colonials who had just overturned centuries of tradition and were attempting to define themselves as something new. So these are the colonials, the colonists, who are trying to develop or create their own persona. Who are they? What is their identity? What does it mean to be an American during this age of reason? And so they're no longer under a monarchy rule. So what does it mean to be a free man in this new world? It's also important to understand that Letters from an American Farmer are written as a piece of fiction. They are not written as fact. However, it's really thought that the ideas come from de Creve Coeur's experiences, and that he uses the character, that de Creve Coeur uses the character of James, the narrator, to describe how social principles are laid out by the new American society and how they operate in the life of an individual American. So he's using this persona basically to describe what it means to be an American. And some of the themes that you'll find in Letters are the nature of American character, and by that I mean the work ethic, how hardworking Americans are, what it means to be an individual. Anti-intellectualism, so he's more interested in the common man. He's not really interested in these great thinkers. And he looks at the farmer as a prototype. The American farmer goes out, works the land, harvests the land, works with nature, works in, against, and around nature, and he sees that as what it means to be an American character or an American being. He looks at the treatment of slaves and the view of immigrants and their ethnicity, and you can see that from the quote that I provided you at the beginning with Paine, is how he's really interested in how we have become this American conglomeration of all different kinds of ethnicities. So how does the Age of Reason impact the Americas? The great philosopher, German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, defined the Enlightenment as the liberation of man from his self-caused state of minority. Minority is the incapacity of using one's understanding without direction of another. This state of minority is self-caused when its source lies not in a lack of understanding, but in a lack of determination to use it without the assistance of another. So in other words, what Kant is saying is that we have made ourselves the other or a minority because we are not trying to think for ourselves. We're not trying to be individuals, but rather we want others to tell us who to be, how to be, what to think. And that is a truly Enlightenment / Age of Reason kind of philosophy, because this is the time when we are no longer looking towards our ministers or a monarchies as the things that tell us what to do and how to think and how to believe. But however, we're more self-directed and thinking about these ideas for ourselves, independently of the monarchy, independently of our religious beliefs. So what I want you to think about as you're reading through these pieces, and constantly ask yourself, what kind of threads of thought can you trace from these authors to the way that we think about America, the way that we think about individuality, the way that we think about our responsibility as an American. See what threads or connections you can see, and also pay attention to the differences. In which way, or in what way are our contemporary beliefs different? How have we changed? How have we maybe turned away from our original beliefs to something that's a little bit different and more, I don't want to say skewed, but certainly different than what the original forefathers intended. So take your time, read through everything, post your questions in the I Have a Question folder.